Okay, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you happen to be. We are kicking off the March 2021 ENSO seminar, which is going to be something of a change of pace from our usual format. Today we have a panel discussion in honor of John Stewart, who passed away recently. John was a biologist, a philosopher, a cognitive scientist, an all-round enthusiastic iconoclast, and a significant figure in the community of inactive researchers in particularly in Europe. He's based in the Technological University of Compiègne, and particularly, I think I would have personally come to know John and appreciate his influence in the early noughties through a series of summer schools which were organized by himself, Charlenet, Olivier Gapin, and others, in which a collection of early career and more established researchers were sort of gathered and would just chat for a week about all things enactive cognitive science. So the first one of these actually produced this book, which is maybe backwards for all of you, but a sort of a useful introduction to enactive cognitive science as a paradigm. So I won't try to discuss or adumbrate John's life or career in any significant way. There's no way to quite capture all of it in its passion and its intensity, but I'm sure it will come through in the discussion. So just to introduce our speakers, or the members of the panel today, and we might be joined by one more before as we go along. But from the University of Compiègne, we have Charlenet and Pierre Steiner, who worked very closely with John for a long period of time. We also have, in no particular order, just according to my particular Zoom setup, Tom Froese, who's running the Embodied Cognitive Science group at the Open Institute of Science and Technology, Inman Harvey at the University of Sussex, Ezekiel De Paolo and Hannah Diaher at the University of the Basque Country, Fred Cummins from UCD, and Killian McHugh from UL. And so if we may have a third member of the panel from Compiègne, Olivier Gapin, if technological issues allow. So without sort of any further ado as such, I think we might sort of move on. Charles, perhaps as someone who would have worked very closely with John for quite some time, if you would like to kickstart the discussion, we'll just run. John had a whole stable full of hobby horses, and we might take a few of them out for a quick trot over the next few minutes.
So I say a few words just to begin. Perhaps I come back after along the discussion. So thank you, Marek, for this invitation. Thank you, Tom, for thinking of it. I think it's a great idea to make this meeting, and so thank you all to be here. Yes, I spent nearly 30 years, or perhaps more, with John, since my PhD, where in the 80s. So I just want to begin by saying that what is for me the most important and original characteristic of John, and this characteristic is, from this point you can understand all his life and his research program. This is the will not to dissociate scientific research and personal life, to be a whole, philosophical reflection, political commitment, life at home, all these things have to work together. And these have multiple consequences. In fact, what is striking is the way one can move back and forth from a personal attitude to an epistemological position, to a theoretical intuition, and even a political commitment. And the personal attitude, the way of existing without distinction between work and home, means also a person on the edge of his skin, full of unveiled emotion, always nearly too enthusiastic or to, I would say, to tear, to cry. On the scientific level, this meant defending research that is not reductionist, but on the contrary, preserves the meaning of what is explained. You have to do that because of this unity. Of course, as you know, in biology, that means fighting against the reduction of the living of development or evolution to a processing of information. In cognitive science, it means promoting an active approach against all forms of computationalism and reductionism. These two struggles that he brought together under the slogan, life equal cognition. That's the deep slogan of John's works. Perhaps I will come back to, depending of how we go in this moment of to remember John and trying to see what he gave us. I will come back perhaps about the, or I can go ahead to speak about the kind of the essential encounters in the scientific life of John, to which I contributed a little. That's of Francisco Varela, of course, and Bernard Stiegler. And it's interesting that to think that in the 80s, when I know John for the first time, he was chercheur in genetic depopulation, genetic of population. How do you say? Theory of evolution. He came from Cambridge. He came in France, and he fight at this time against hereditarism, the reduction of men to the heredity. And in this fight, it was a very great thing to discover the work of Francisco Varela and all the things that we know very well in this seminar. That was for John a real revelation and a real new beginning in his scientific research. And the other encounters is the meeting with Bernard Stiegler. It's very important to make the Compiègne way of in cognitive science. That's a meeting between technology and cognition. By understanding that technology, as we said, was anthropologically constitutive. That means that we are human because we are surrounded and supported by technical devices. That's help John to make the social intervene in individual cognition. And that's also something very important for this unity between political commitment, scientific understanding, personal life. So all this circulation of idea was very stimulating for big discussion. In Compiègne, we have this pleasure for many years and many evenings spending together in these intensive discussions. So that's what I could say just to begin this tour.
Thanks very much, Charles.
I don't know what about the other who want to speak now. Perhaps Tom will think about that. And I don't know.
Okay, so thank you for that introduction, and it's interesting to know that this goes back to the 80s.
Yes.
When was I born? 1981. So it's a lifetime.
Yes.
In its own right. So yeah, I think that one of the important legacies for a few of us here are definitely the social aspect. So these early meetings in France, in which we came together as students and to see what our supervisors were battling out in terms of ideas of what was enactivism and whatnot, and there was always a very lively social component to that, which makes sense in this larger picture of that the science has to be coherent with how we live as people and how we relate to each other socially. And it really felt like it had a stronger coherence because of that, and a stronger attraction because of that than some of the other paradigms that were around. At least for me, that was one of the attractions, that somehow you didn't have to put on two different caps, right? Okay, now I go to the lab and I'm a scientist and I have to pretend that genes are selfish and that everything is controlled. Mm-hmm. And then I go home and say, hey, now, I want to hang out with my friends and be a person like everybody else. So that kind of schizophrenic game that we sometimes, are taught to play when we first enter into science was something that was not required here. And that felt very liberating. And I think John really lived that, and put that on display that for everyone to see, and I really appreciated that.
Yes.
It was a phrase actually that I was very struck by. It was at one of the, I think maybe the second in Action School, when John was chairing the kind of plenary free-for-all discussion at the end of the school, and he noted that once you acknowledged a kind of interdependency between objectivity and subjectivity, that they weren't these sort of two entirely separate domains, but were interrelated in important ways, that to be more objective, it was required to be more subjective. And he sort of put it very starkly in just those terms. In order to, if I want to be more objective, I've got to be more subjective. And it was sort of quite a challenging notion, but it does, it sort of illustrates nicely the importance of, well, if we want to understand the whole process of science and our capacity to measure and understand the world, we've got to be willing to bring ourselves to the table and understand our own role in that whole process very, fully as well.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree with that, and it's interesting to think that when we include the subjective, which is like the personal, some people see that as a move towards anti-realism or something like that, right? Oh, but now you're saying everything is relative. But to some extent, I think it actually is a stronger kind of realism. We're adding something. We're also saying the subject is also real, not just the world. The subject is also real. Both are real, right? So it's just expanding, the notion of reality to also include ourselves, which I think makes a lot of sense, because if we're not real, then how can everything else that we experience be real, right? So, but yeah, so to make this move, a little bit away from a kind of, a relativist position, there's always this danger when you bring in the subjective that you drift off towards some kind of relativism, but he was very good at bringing in the subject without going down that road, which is not an easy balance to maintain, but he somehow did it. Yeah.
If I may, on this issue of science and subjectivity, I first met John in 2004. It was in Oléron. It was not an enaction summer school, but it was a summer school organized by the French CNRS on the topic reference to objects. And it was organized by people at the Institut Jean Nicot, which was at the time already a very classical orthodox place for the classical computational theory of mind. And I was a young student there, and John was there as well. And I was totally impressed by the fact that all the time he was raising his hand and asking and addressing objections to the people. And so, of course, because of the context, he was very quickly seen, as an outsider, but I was very impressed by the courage he had constantly all alone just to question, the main speakers there. The main speaker was Zenon Pilichin, with a very big name of the constructive theory of mind. But John didn't mind. He was always, asking the question. And I was very impressed by this. And of course, I met him at this time. And after that, I was lucky enough to arrive to Compiègne in order to take John courses, because John had to stop teaching because he was retired, and he didn't want to be retired, but he was forced being retired. And it was very touching for me because on the one hand, when I arrived in Compiègne, I saw that he was bitter, he was sad, stopping teaching, and it's perfectly understandable. But on the other hand, he was absolutely kind and caring with me since I was taking his courses. He was a true gentleman for this, and this was something very, 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 very important for me. And after that, we had, as many people are here, we had many occasions to discuss on many topics. Basically, first it was in the train, because I was living in Paris then, and he too. So when we went to Compiègne every Monday morning, we sat in the train together and we discussed. But then when I moved to Compiègne, I lost this opportunity of talking with John in the train. So we had many exchanges by email because it was difficult to discuss, in Compiègne during the meetings. And there is one topic I would like to mention because it was very important for me. And I think for him too, and this is a topic which has already been mentioned, it is the issue of the relations between science and values. As you know well, for John, what matters is not to agree, but to agree on what we disagree. That is, he loved doing this. And we had a basic disagreement about which we learned to disagree concerning the place of values in science. We both accepted that there is no value-free science. That is, there is no science without methodological, but also ethical, political, and ideological values. It's a matter of fact in history and in the way science proceeds. But John was much more radical than me, because at one point he was ready to say that, it was perfectly acceptable to reject a theory because it goes against the values we have. For instance, John says, a very good reason not to endorse the classical computational theory of mind is that, I wouldn't like to be seen as a computer. I refuse this. So it's a reason to reject the theory. I was more caring with this. But at one point in our regular exchanges, he sent me an email which I found for preparing the session. And I would like to read you a brief excerpt of this email. It's in French, but then I will make the translation in English. So I quote, this is John speaking, so to say. Nous touchons ici à un point décisif. Pour moi, ça a été la lutte de toute une vie, de scientifique, de faire valoir que la science n'est pas neutre. Plus encore, qu'elle n'a pas à être neutre. Les deux aspects comptent pour moi. Premièrement, la science n'est pas neutre, de fait, et sa prétendue neutralité n'est qu'une façade idéologique qui cache sa volonté de maîtrise et de domination, en connivence avec le capitalisme. J'arrête mon char là. Et deuxièmement, normativement, la science n'a pas à être neutre, car si réellement elle l'était, si réellement il n'y avait pas de valeur en jeu, alors il n'y aurait aucune raison de s'y consacrer. So I do it in English quickly. This is a decisive point. For me, it has been the struggle of all my life of scientists to defend the claim that science is not neutral, is not value-free. Moreover, it doesn't have to be neutral. Two aspects count for me. First, science is not neutral. Its alleged neutrality is just a way to hide his will to master and dominate in relation with capitalism. And secondly, I assume science doesn't have to be neutral, because if science were neutral, there would be no point in doing science. And I think that this second claim is very, very true. And John expressed it very beautifully. That is, well, he showed that without some passion, without some existential commitments, there would be absolutely no point at all in doing science. This is something I do and I try to enact every day, and it is very important for me.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's very interesting.
I'd like to add something to what's been said already, which is all very interesting and I agree with. And I think it goes together with what's been said already, which is that science or research in general is something that is done by communities. And it was a very special time when I met John, because I was doing my PhD at Sussex. And then I had many opportunities to visit Compiègne and the community there. And it was a big surprise when after I finished my PhD, I had to go somewhere else. And I realized how special those communities have been. You know, they were very unusual. And they were unusual because of characters like John's. I mean, in the sense that, John embodied a certain ethos, a certain way of, the whole community caring for itself, listening to itself. It didn't matter very much whether you were new to it, you were just a newcomer. I mean, you had a voice, whereas many academic communities, that's not the case. I mean, you have to struggle to get a voice in. And John would actually be a promoter of that horizontality, and which is also something I found at Sussex. It's not when you look at the development of new ideas and the development of the enactive approach, I mean, how many people have passed through Sussex or Compiègne that are today doing research on an action? I mean, I look at this panel today and I probably think probably all of us. But that means that there have been a time where these communities were doing something right. And what we're doing something right has to do a little bit with this blurring of boundaries. The blurring of boundaries in academic terms, you could have a voice and say something about linguistics, even if your background was in biology, it was fine. Or from philosophy of technology, if you didn't know much about it, the people who knew about it would still listen to you. But also the boundaries between the personal and the research, and all kinds of boundaries. And I have an interesting thing that happened to me precisely with respect to these aspects of being in the community or outside the community, was that as soon as I finished my PhD at Sussex, I got a job that, let's say, to put it mildly, wasn't very good for me. And I was thinking or feeling that my career was, approaching the boundary of viability. And therefore, at that point, it was John who said to me, why don't you come and visit me in Portugal? He was working part-time or some time, part of the year in Portugal for a couple of weeks. And that kind of saved I wouldn't say my career, but it saved my attitude to be engaged again with somebody who, in a way, in a single person, embodied all those values of the research community. So in a way, that's kind of, to me, I'm very interested in all the specific research issues, philosophical problems that we're talking about. But in a way, I think all of them are actually embodied in this attitude of sustaining a community. And as everybody here knows, he could be very much you know, in big meetings. He could be the one who was establishing. He was at the forefront of telling everybody, this is how we do this thing here. We can talk to each other. We can ask difficult questions. We can have loud discussions. That doesn't mean it's any problem with that. That later we go for a drink, and that's going to be fine. And I think that is something that I appreciate very much. I mean, it's not only John, it's many of us, but John in a way was a sort of a figure that if you had to put all those values in one person, I mean, he was probably the person who was closest to that. And I think that's what I appreciate the most when I remember John.
Man up. Oh, Anna, you have something to say more? Oh, amen.
Okay, I'll say something. I first met John in 1991, which is nearly 30 years ago, which is horrifying. That was at the ECAL in Paris, where I saw him give a talk there and spoke to him briefly, and then our paths have crossed at different places, Sussex, Compiègne, at workshops, at conferences, including Portugal. And I'd like to thank you, Charles, for your introductory piece, because I thought that summed him up perfectly for me. And that was very illuminating. And one thing to be emphasized is I always think of him as a gentleman and a scholar, and above all, a really nice guy, a thoroughly nice guy that you would look forward to seeing and chatting to and very comfortable with. And that's my overabiding impression. On the issue of subjectivity and objectivity, which is, Marek, you gave a quote. What was your quote again from John saying something about objectivity and subjectivity? Can you recall
from the summer school, I just remember a phrase. I'm not sure if I'm getting it verbatim, obviously, but it's something along the lines of, in order to be more objective, we must be more subjective. Okay.
Well, as with so many things, I'm so sympathetic with John's general approach. I've disagreed with him on details, but his general approach, and I wasn't aware of that particular way of his, but that's very resonant with something I believe, which is that by being I am a relativist, in fact, and emphasizing the importance of subjectivity as expanding the realm of the objective, in the sense that objectivity seems to me to be intersubjective agreement, and it is a communal approach. Science is a communal activity, and lots of scientific advances, such as Copernican revolution, for example, was expanding the range of subjectivity, imagining what it would be like to be on another planet looking at the sun and the moon and the star and the earth. And by expanding the range of subjectivity, we develop what we call objective, are these things that are shared subjectively. And so that's my own interpretation of what John's words, Marek quoted, probably put more elegantly. It fits in with what Ezekiel just said now about science being a communal process. And as with so many things, I find myself just totally sympathetic with John's ideas, and John as being such a sympathetic person himself.
It's an interesting way, just the way you put it there, because it strikes me then, as soon as you recognize that kind of interdependency between the subjective and the objective, it entails, in order, if you were to attempt some kind of full objectivity, you would have to exhaust all the possibilities of subjectivity. And given that the way everyone defines subjectivity is that it's always a bit hazy or negotiable or fluid and uncertain, all of those characteristics then essentially get bound up in those aspects of the world that we consider to be objective then as well. It's kind of a just your notion of expanding the subjective expands the realm of the objective too is a kind of a nice way of articulating that point, or certainly bringing it forward.
Yes, I see the Copernican revolution as having brought subjectivity to expand the realm of the objective in astronomy. Relativity, as Einstein did the same with basic physics, and cognitive science is still really awaiting its Copernican revolution, which is getting to grips with the relationship between the subjective and the objective.
If I may add, this is something that John was sharing with all the people he met, but also on a purely biographical point of view, this is something he lived very early in his career, because before meeting us, and I think that even before I or Tom or Anna was born, he entered the French CNRS, and he was in social sciences. He was one of the first in France really being an actor in sociology of science. And because of his background in science, well, it was very, very important for him. And so there were at that time, there were many, so to say, ways, to make science more democratic, more popular. There was also a movement, asking, for scientists to be reflective about their choices, their stance, and so on. And John was actually with Jean-Marc Lévy-Leblond in France, was a real actor of this in the early 80s. So I mean, it's a very, very long time ago. So so before he came back in his interest in biology and genetics with Francisco Varela, well, before that he worked for a long time, and it never left his mind, in matters regarding sociology of knowledge and sociology of science. And even recently, as you know, he made a very impressive work on Durkheim and Alfredson Rettel on the origins of the social categories, and it's very impressive, how he mastered the books and the ideas of those people.
It seems like there's a few interesting ideas of a philosophy of science floating around here. So maybe I can just kind of try to distill some of them. So it seems like the consensus here is that the kind of classical view of philosophy of science, where objectivity just depends on how the world is not really supported in this community. But then, then we move on to say, is it the community, that grants the objectivity? There's a social component there, but then what Pierre was saying, which was also very interesting, is that, then John, from his personal point of view, said, if this theory offends my, personal values, and I don't like to be, considered in this way, then I'm free to also reject that theory as like, a non-viable theory, and I need to look for something else. So it seems like, we could use evidence to decide between theories. We could look for community consensus to decide between theories. Or at a very personal level, I can make a personal choice to decide between theories. So, I don't know how these things are related, but it seems like there's a few, maybe not entirely compatible options on the table.
If I may say something quick about that, I mean, my interpretation of what Pierre said, that if a theory really deeply shocks your values at a personal level, I wouldn't interpret that to mean the theory must be wrong. It's more like there is a real conflict here because these values are also real. To say that there is a problem of taking that attitude as a scientist is to accept the fact-value dichotomy as given. And this is, as an activist, we have been questioning this all the time. So the value is evidence. The value that you're shocked by it is evidence of something. It's evidence of a conflict. Now, from there, you can develop the initial dissonance into a clear perspective that says, no, this theory is wrong. I mean, I'm not rejecting this value simply because a theory says I should. But at the same time, I should be open to, as everything, my knowledge and my values can evolve. And if I cannot really ever say why this theory is wrong, then I have a problem and this conflict doesn't get resolved. So the idea is that the opportunity is given to you to say, if this is really dissonant with my perspective on the world and my personal life, it must mean that something is not quite right. This theory doesn't capture everything. Obviously, it doesn't capture me. So in that sense, it is what we were talking about, using the subjectivity as part of the things we're investigating, as part of the evidence that gives us knowledge about what's going on, and at a community level too, not just at a personal level. It's more likely that if this is shared by many people, the stronger the possibility that we are onto something, that this theory, say, a computational view of mind, is not really quite covering something that we live through. And I think that's what I like about enactive ideas, is that it is all about bringing the actors, the community into the process of knowledge and knowledge generation, which is something that we kind of intuitively know already. And at the same time, other people have already very much dealt at length with it, especially feminist critiques of philosophy of science, like a standpoint theory, Sandra Harding, Nancy Hartstock. So all of those have already been there, but at the same time, we just live it. And now in the same theories that we're working on, this is coming up as an issue again. I'm thinking of Hannah, not to prompt her to speak, but I'm thinking of her as her recent work on engaged epistemology. It's like you're transformed by the act of knowing. So there is no separation, and at the same time, no reason why we shouldn't think of it as science. It's still science. It's still research. It's just that it's expanded.
Yes, and I agree with that. And to go on this way, I think that what John liked so much in Francisco Varela and all the enactive approach is that this way of making science and cognition is not the representation. We speak here about theory, false or true, but the question was not this. It is the question of viability of did this way of thinking works? Is it okay? Could we make a world with that? And so this is this anti-representationalist epistemology way of thinking what is knowledge that is the thing he catch with big pleasure in all this inactive approach, because it was something he was searching for before when he was in sociology of science, with difficulty to link scientific research and social criticism. But through the inactive approach, he find a way to make a science that works not just at a technological level, but at a political level, that works in a way to build the world we want to build.
And there was among John's many mottos or quotations, which I remember. There is one he often said was, when we enact a theory of cognition, we enact ourselves in the bargain. That is, there is no difference. And so on the other hand, the way we enact ourselves today should matter, you know, for a reflection or a theory of cognition. And very recently, but well before there was all these fears about this issue, he was very concerned 5 or 6 years ago with what he called already ecological crisis. I mean, it was very important for him, and he wrote several papers on this well before many intellectuals today, rightly, of course, pay attention to the problem. Because for him, this issue was very real and was a problem, of course, for the people, for scientists who wants to know what is cognition, what is intelligence. He said, well, how is it possible that there is such a failure in collective intelligence when we are supposed to be all individual or rational? What is the problem? You know, so it was also, you know, a very recent example of, oh, you know, what was around him in terms of actuality, of discussions and issues about global warming, really deeply affected, you know, his way of thinking about things.
That's a very interesting topic, because I think it maybe highlights some other interesting tensions. And so one of his colleagues and friends, Bruno Latour, you know, started as a social constructivist in saying, you know, facts are basically social constructs in the lab, and we don't need to care about whether they match reality or not. And then basically, you know, then there's the problem is, well, does that make us somehow climate change deniers, you know, or at least, you know, does it maybe undermine the political power that we would need in order to change something about it if we put it in such a, you know, constructivist framework? And I think that's something that he actually struggled with in his own work, to try to find a way to preserve, on the one hand, you know, the role of the subject and the social relations of the community of scientists, and on the other hand, you know, make sure that we give enough weight to what's happening in the world around us.
The charges that one faces in public debate are very strange. So the debate between realism and various forms of idealism or relativism is always just fraught and fractious. And in the 2011 book, John went straightforwardly said inaction is a constructivist approach. He put that in his chapter, and that was, for me, I didn't understand why he would have said that when it seemed that inaction was rather something else to me. But I'm beginning to realize now that it provided him with a way of deflecting some of these anxieties about subjectivity, objectivity, and so on. But it's interesting that you should the problems of which term one uses, objectivity in parenthesis, relativism, constructivism. You use Latour as an example, and it's funny because people never stop throwing stuff at Latour, shooting Latour, pouring buckets of boiling water on them. Nobody has worked harder in climate change than that man. It's really, really, really surprising to me. I don't know what function this label constructivism had, what it did for John. I found it very interesting, and it's not one that we use widely, but it's a useful kind of position sometimes to take to fend off some of these attacks, and but then you open yourself up to others. Was there much discussion around that time about that use of that label and which brand of constructivism we're talking about?
I see Ezekiel smiling there. Ezekiel, you want to comment?
Well, I don't want to talk so much, but I think I prefer to. I think I do this as an exercise to see how much I can say without mentioning any isms. Okay, and I think that is probably the attitude that for me leaves the options open to continue to develop where we need to develop. And then I wouldn't say that constructivism is a particularly useful one for me, because it kind of starts to bring all these questions that Tom was talking about. It's like, well, but how can we be realist? If we are constructivists, how can we then deal with the actual real problems and crises that we're facing? I think actually what's better, I mean, I like very much the latest work of John's on the origin of cognitive categories. You know, the origin, taking the work of Marxists, you know, like Alfred Sondredel and Durkheim and so on, and to say, You see how we often start by saying that we know what space is, what quantity is, what time is. Well, actually, these are things we have been building together as societies. This concept was different in a different society with a different mode of production and so on and so forth, which doesn't mean our concept is any less real or their concept wasn't real. It was real for what it was and what practical purpose it served. So that's the thing that matters here. If we need to be realistic, we just have to, grapple those concepts and ideas that are the most real for us today, that we need today. And I don't think that then, there is a cartographic tendency in philosophy, that you just put things in the right place in their map. And then the maps are static, maps don't move. So that's the problem with it. We say, well, if this is constructivism, it doesn't get out of this island of constructivism, and we need to go over there to Middle Earth to come to Mordor. And therefore, that is the problem with the isms and the mapology that we often revert to. We come back to it, and I think it's not the most useful way to deal with things. Sometimes we need those labels, but I think we should take them as fluid, as changing, and it's probably what John has been doing. I mean, for me, he was an example of somebody who was driven by the ideas and not the labels. And maybe he may have used some labels here at different points in time because they best express their ideas, the ideas he was behind. But at the same time, I think it's all fluid, and it's one thing that we precisely need to unlearn, to say just to put things in boxes. No, better. It's not the best way necessarily. We have to take the metaphor of the map, and it's not quite the right one. It's more like the flows of ideas that I like more dynamic. I wish we had a particle, an ending particle in English or in other languages like ism, that signifies a flowing idea, an idea that is still developing and we don't know where it's going next. That would be the right thing to use, but we don't have that in language. So yeah. Sorry, I didn't want to continue to intervene.
Maybe we can circle it back to the quote about to be more objective, you have to be more subjective. We because of the way we are used to thinking, we think, oh, there's object and subject, ooh, separate things. But actually, maybe as he said it, apparently, to be more objective, you have to be more subjective is a moving thing. The subjective and the objective move, expand together in the way you said, John said that. I mean, just now looking at the phrase, I wrote it down, I realized that it is, when you say it like that, you can also look at the sentence in a different way, where it does move and where it does expand, and both of them expand. And it comes also back to the intersubjective and how we make meaning together, we make these theories together. And John, in regard to our work on participatory sense making, also placed that very well together with Pierre. In the societal realm, and his sociology background came very forceful towards our work to pull participatory sense making towards society. But also, I think it's still important to see that subjective and objective are transformed with each other. It's not that objective is intersubjectively verified. No, we make it together and participate in it. And I think in the way Charles introduced John as a person, and several of you did, that doing all of that in one's life is living that, becoming that ongoingly. And maybe that's more ways of speaking that can help express and do that at the same time.
I very much like that reflection, and I also wanted to loop back to exactly the same quote, Hannes. I'm glad that you brought it up. And also linking it back to what Inman said about expanding subjectivity is what actually drove, physics to new objectivity. So I just wanted to maybe just pause for a moment and think, what could that mean in cognitive science? And my feeling is that it's the lack of, recognition of our own subjectivity, which drives and motivates representationalism and computationalism, right? So if you cannot take your own subjectivity seriously, you have to look for it elsewhere, right? And then you say, hey, it's because it's in my brain, right? So I need to look for this homunculus in my brain, which perceives and does things and decides things and infers things. And so if you then tell them, well, we don't need that, well, then people get very worried, like, what do you mean? You know, you want to get rid of the mind and things like that? You know, are you eliminativist? And then the actually kind of like what I think is more satisfying alternative to that is to say, no, because you're already subjective, you know, like you're the subject. You don't need to look for the subject inside your brain, right? So to some extent, you know, expanding subjectivity in that way, then, you know, means that we don't have to look for it elsewhere. And that way, potentially, you know, put the whole science in a more solid foundation that is more coherent, where you don't have to outsource your subjectivity somewhere else. I don't know, Iman, if that's, you know, if that resonates with you or.
Yes, well, I think a lot of the problem comes from the way our language forces us into thinking of subjectivity as a thing, and comparing subjectivity and objectivity. That's completely wrong. It's treating the subjective as if it was another object.
Exactly, right.
Yes. Simplifying, I mean, the way I think of it is, supposing we're all standing around the Eiffel Tower, some of us to the north, some of us to the west, some to the south, some to the east. We all have our own perspective on the Eiffel Tower. And the object, the Eiffel Tower, is what we can share, we can talk about it in common, even though we have different perspectives on it. Our perspectives aren't Eiffel Towers, our perspectives are of the Eiffel Tower. So the objective is what we can share, and pragmatically we can orientate ourselves, even though we've got different views of the Eiffel Tower, we can orient ourselves around it. And the objectivity comes from the shared subjective perspectives. That's how the Copernican revolution happened. That's how the Einsteinian revolution happened. It expands the role of the objective when we appreciate more properly the difference between the views of the Eiffel Tower from the north and the east side. And so, to my mind, it's just, it's not complex stuff. It's really simple childlike stuff. In fact, the whole notion of object permanence in a child comes from when a toy train goes through a tunnel and reappears the other end of the tunnel. At a certain age, they think it's disappeared. At some later stage, they come to think that, okay, it was permanent while it was going through the tunnel. It just wasn't visible to me. And that is the objectivity of the train while it was in the tunnel is making sense for the child with the former subjective experience and the later subjective experience. And so as you develop, the expanded subjectivity allows you to expand the realm of the objective. There's no conflict between objectivity and subjectivity. They're not to be compared one with the other. They're two ends of the telescope.
It strikes me that there's a sort of a nice comment on that Ezekiel touched on earlier, which has to do with the ranges of evidence that are allowed into the conversation. That, you know, when Ezekiel made the point that our visceral rejection of a theory, just as Pierre had quoted him, what is, you know, that is evidence, and to be, you know, to be expansive in those, in the arrays of evidence that we allow into the science. So essentially, whatever we're calling science then is just, and Fred talks about this a lot. So science is in essence those set of practices by which we sanctify certain observations of the world as holding, or as sort of as being the truth, or whatever it is, depending on precisely how you frame science to be. But it means that for someone like John, all observations, everything's go. Like, it's not only science when you put on a lab coat and you separate the lab from the rest of the world. And in fact, that's weakening the science. Whenever you make that division to say, well, no, here's this is the evidence we'll accept, and we won't accept that evidence. Rather than, you know, if there's evidence you disagree with, or if you think there's some problematic, if you think it's unpersuasive, you can still engage it and negotiate with it and explain why it's unpersuasive. but at least it plays a role. I mean, it was one of my little anecdotes for John was when we had the summer school here in Ireland, and we had a sort of a session which I kind of, it was sort of an evening session where everyone could bring their gadgets. You know, we had with the inactive torch, and I think Compiègne brought a couple of devices that had been developed there, and Gilles Moran had brought a couple of sort of sense mixing examples of just ways in which we can sort of change consciousness or experience kinds of subjectivity that we wouldn't without those particular devices. I didn't have any devices to bring, so I brought a couple of ping pong balls, which we cut in half and stuck over our eyes in the hope of creating a Ganzfeld. And we just kind of did it for giggles. We sort of did it for a few minutes, and that was fine. And I took the whole evening rather jocularly. You know, it was just a bit of fun as a way to relax and yet have some interesting conversations at the same time. But the next day, I got a 500-word email from John about his experience with the ping pong balls, because there's no such thing as evidence that doesn't matter. You know, what was just a playful thing for him was an opportunity to learn, to experience, and to grow. And it was sort of a lovely example of the way in which all of John's passion was coming. If you asked him the time, you were getting the full-on John experience, and probably a discussion about what time was, and how time systems worked as well. So, but that way in which we partial out what gets to be evidence and what doesn't, is actually a means by which power structures are maintained and enforced in societies. And insofar as we accept them or work according to them, then it is very much a political act to do so.
And yes, and I think that this is something which resonates with another key idea for John and other people. Of course, it's the importance of technology. That is, we are talking about subjectivity, about objectivity, about the importance of intersubjectivity, but there is also, of course, for John and other people, the fact that, well, if objectivity is achieved, if it is made, you know, by a community, it's very often also because of the use of the technologies. And if you don't pay attention to the technologies, like the technology of representation, like external representations, if you don't think about it, well, you are under the spell, under the illusion that objectivity is just, you know, something already there that you just discover, that you just find. Whereas for John, no, if you think about the representational ways and other ways we use to achieve objectivity, well, the perspectives are totally changing. And you know, John was, as you know, was always, you know, against, and I think it's a key idea, you know, the picture of enactivism as a theory only working, you know, for very low sensory motor life, and just that. You see, no, he was adamant and totally cried. He said that no, we can also, you know, account, you know, for so-called, very badly called, higher level, so to say, forms of cognition, because in the ways, you know, we can rely on linguistic coupling, but also intersubjectivity and technology. And he was, I'm so often heard him, you know, reminding the importance of this view, which I think is absolutely correct, and that we all share. It's also, I mean, technology was also very important for him, and of course, it's related to the place he was working in, Compiègne, where, as Charles reminded, he met Bernard Stiegler at the end of the 80s.
Thanks, Pierre. Well, I'm afraid I'm looking at the time, and I realize our session has essentially run its course. He says now, but I'm sort of fully aware and reflective and nervous about making casual references to systems of time and impositions of boundaries. But I think we might wrap things up, I guess, but I don't want to do so if anyone would like to make any final comments or to finish up the session. Please do.
Can I share just one photo of John here just for a second?
Yeah. Is this the one with the ping pong balls? I had hoped I couldn't find it.
I have the one with the ping pong ball.
All right. In which case, I need to. I probably need to allow sharing. Hang on a moment. There you go. That should all be good.
And this, I believe, is the Ganzfeld effect in question. Anyway, that's suitably
With all seriousness in the experiment, yes.
We have Ezekiel and Marek doing that as well, mind you.
Thank you, John. That's
Yes.